Hello, everyone. Today is Tuesday, October 13th. As always, I'm your host for Collectibles and Coffee, Edward Nguyen. Today, we will have an interview with special guest, Jason Alt of Brainstorm Brewery. That's probably where most people know him. He's fairly active on Twitter as well. I've had the pleasure of meeting him once or twice when I've attended Grand Prix Detroit. So he is well known for his discussion on Brainstorm Brewery and being an EDH expert, I guess. We can leave it at that.
Sure.
So, with that, beverage choice today, just black coffee for me, nothing too terribly interesting. We'll go and get right in. Jason, tell us a bit about yourself, who you are, what you're drinking, and we'll just kind of hop right in. And then, where'd you get your start in Magic?
Sounds good. My name's Jason Alt. I write the 75% EDH column on CoolStuffInc.com. I write an EDH focused finance column for MTGPrice.com. I'm on the Brainstorm Brewery podcast, like you said. I'm on a podcast with another Magic the Gathering alumnus, John Dunning, on the They Said We Said YouTube channel called Film Hooligans, and I'm the content manager at EDHRec.com. So I have been staying busy during the pandemic. One way to fuel that is by doing a little day drinking. I'm drinking a 4.6% watermelon goes from Founders Brewing in Grand Rapids, Michigan, called Green Zebra. And it's 5 o'clock somewhere, just not anywhere on land, I guess. But whatever. A little day drinking never hurt card sorting or engaging in the rough business of MTG finance during a pandemic when basically, stores aren't open.
Good stuff. Good stuff. I knew that you did produce content outside Brainstorm Brewery and EDH Rec as well. I just couldn't remember exactly where you wrote.
Oh yeah, it's better to throw it to the guest than like say something weird. I've had some weird intros. You did fine. This is going really well.
For everyone who wants to check out Jason's content, I will make sure to get some info from him afterwards, and it'll be linked in the tweets and YouTube comments below. So, kind of just a bit background. How did you get your start with Magic? Where did it all start?
So I got my start with Magic back in like '96 when I was on a camping trip with a friend of mine who was telling me all about the terrible stuff he thought was fun in this card game. And I was like, oh, well, why don't you spend 3 hours explaining it to me? And then he just explained it to me. So by the time he was done with his like spiel, I was super pumped and went out and got a 4th edition gift set. So my brother and I could each have a deck and play against each other. And Ice Age was out at the time, I think, or like came out soon after. So cards were terrible, but like we didn't know that. So I just kept playing and playing. I moved to the UK and like it was just getting started over there, sort of in a big way. So I was sort of on the cusp of like new stores opening, and tournaments and stuff like that. I played my first regionals in Manchester. So that was cool. So by the time I came back, I had a little tournament experience and I was like the best player in my high school, which like means nothing. Um, I'm from Michigan, so I would drive 2 hours to the east side of the state and just get smashed at everything by Team RIW. Like Pat Chapin was still active, Herbert Holtz was still active in those days. So like I wasn't winning anything in Michigan growing up, but like I feel like getting smashed by people from Team RIW, people that played at Pandemonium games in Garden City, Michigan, I guess technically. I feel like getting smashed by really good players kind of helped. So I played through college, and I kind of just stuck with it. I sold my collection a lot, but like I never quit. Nobody ever quits this game, I think. So around the time I graduated from college, I was working in the pharmaceutical field and spending a lot of time with Ryan Bouchard because he, when I was living in Lansing, I used to pal around with Ryan all the time. So I was up in Lansing visiting him, and he was telling me that he was planning to quit his engineering job and like pursue backpack grinding full time. And I was like, well, if you need any help getting your business started, I'm on a 1-year contract with the lab I'm working at. So if that contract ends and they don't offer me a position, I might have some like time and some unemployment. I could help out. And that was like 10 years ago, and I never really went back to the lab after that. I've been doing MTG finance full time for almost a decade.
That's very cool. Like 2010 was a pretty different era. I think 2010 was
Oh yeah.
let's see. That was before Modern because Modern was introduced in 2011. 2010, I think Star City, their circuit was just getting started with the Star City Open Series.
Hmm.
I think, what was the Magic set? I think that was probably around Scars and Mirrodin. Probably around that
Yeah.
time. Yeah. So very, very different era. MTG Finance, obviously much smaller back then when we got first started. That was probably like around the time I started doing it as well. I did it kind of on a much lower level in the sense that I wasn't actively traveling because I was still in college. I just did a lot of online trading. This was when like MOTL was still a thing. People were still using forums like
Mm.
MTG Salvation to really do that. And that was kind of the extent to which I was doing MTG Finance. But 10 years ago, very, very different game than it is now. I think EDH, which we'll get into here because that's really what I consider to be like most well known for. And obviously, you do most of your content with relating directly to EDH. But I think EDH then was really in its infancy still. I think it was a very, very narrow format. I think Wizards didn't even produce their first Commander decks until 2011, right? So this is a very, very different time than it is now. And let's talk about EDH Rec. That was something that you said that you do content for. So just let's kind of give us a bit of background about that.
EDH Rec started as a Reddit bot. The programmer Don Miner just decided to program a bot so people could type in like the commander they were playing is like, here's a list of common cards for that, and that was popular. So he kind of spruced up the code a little bit, and it was getting to the point where like the Reddit posts were pretty long because it was like a reply, and people were just like spamming the bot. And he's like, you know what? Let's just make a website. So he made the website EDH Rec, cleaned up the user interface a little bit, so you like had card images and stuff like that. But there were no articles, and I came along probably about 5 years ago now, and I said I think there should be some articles to contextualize this data a little bit because some of the times it's like, why is this card in the deck? And if you can't figure it out, maybe it would be nice to have an explanation for that, or maybe we could talk about why certain cards aren't in the deck, and then we got even broader. It was like, well, why write about individual commanders when we can just sort of write about the concept of EDH rec data? So as much as like the site's articles are very focused on just EDH rec kind of internally, I feel like there's a real dearth of quality EDH articles around the net. So I think people that have like no interest in the data want to write for us too, and it's been tough. I don't know what the solution to that is. Maybe another content website, because I know like Cool Stuff Inc. has quite a few EDH writers. I'm one of like 5 or 6 or 7 EDH writers on Cool Stuff, but like there's no hub for EDH content besides EDH Rec. And as much as that's what we wanted, I would like to see some more opportunities for people to create content other places. So um, uh, as much as people really seem to prefer YouTube, I guess, I still think that like written content is valuable, and I think as much as that's sort of feels archaic at this point, I really think if you're trying to build a deck, it's easier to read an article than watch a video because you got to pause the video or whatever. I think it's much cleaner to just have a set of written instructions, or have like a good user interface where you can kind of look at like a list of cards and figure out what you want to add. So I thought it was valuable to add articles to EDH Rec a couple years ago, and it's just grown from there.
For those of you out there who may not be super familiar with EDH Rec, URL is edhrec.com. For me, like my first real foray into this, to be perfectly honest, I don't play Commander. I've probably played less than like 5 games Commander in my life, and usually those are results of people just kind of hand me a deck. Hey, we need a fourth person, come sit down and play with us. And it's like, sure, I guess. the extent to which I've used EDH Rec, and I've looked at it more recently, kind of objectively from someone who would be a consumer who would be consuming this content and thinking about it. I think, like you mentioned, the articles, there is a good spread of articles. I think that there's a pretty good range of writers that will talk about a pretty wide array of things. Mainly because I think the nature of EDH, of Commander, is that it's so open. People being able to express themselves via their deck, I think that's a big draw to Commander itself. And again, looking at the articles, like you said, I think the nature of Magic, of deck building, does require written articles kind of in perpetuity, right? Even though a lot of the nature of where we are, in the pandemic and whatnot, like there is a lot of movement. People are consuming content via YouTube, Twitch. Both of those have seen like a huge surge in demand and people consuming that content. EDH Rec has like having both videos on the front page and content itself. I think it really gives something for people who are active in EDH, like kind of best of both worlds. And so I think that part does it very well. And for me, I really like the data that's available, like just right at the top. Cards, commander sets, like just looking at all these things, being able to look at like the top cards, right? Those are obviously going to be your best sellers. I've definitely found, like for me in my mind, I've definitely seen like some cards that I didn't know were good at EDH. This was obviously some time ago, right? Like I'm pretty sure it's no surprise, but like it's no surprise nowadays, right? But like Cultivate, that was something that people looked over for the longest time because it's been reprinted so many times, but it's still bulk. It's still a bulk pick. It's still something that you can, if you're a store, you'll always be able to churn through. You always do well with. So for me, like that's a lot of the value. And kind of shifting our discussion here. How do you think EDH has really kind of changed MTG finance from where we were, in 2010 when you first said you got your start, right? And now EDH is kind of, back then EDH was an afterthought, kind of like this grassroots format that people are slowly building up, and now Commander is really kind of front and center, it feels like, for WotC's MO.
It's driving the paper market, and I don't think that was as easy a sell to some people in the finance community as it is now in the pandemic, where like people are playing webcam EDH, and that's like who's buying paper cards. Paper sucks right now, but EDH is really kind of just driving prices. The thing about correct deck list formats where like this is the version of Sneak and Show you should be playing. It's like it drives a ton of cards up astronomically, but like the stuff that's not in that deck doesn't get touched. So Legacy is responsible for maybe 100 cards total, like at a time, right? A Legacy metagame. Modern's like a couple hundred. Standard's probably a couple hundred. The worse Standard gets, the fewer cards it spikes harder. EDH is the reason that more than like 500 cards total are worth more than bulk. I really believe that. It started as a bulk rare format, but it just couldn't stay a bulk rare format because there were so many good cards that are people like, oh, I just need this. Like every time they reprint something to keep it bulk, it's sort of like, well, EDH would have made that $3 in a couple of years. And maybe $3 isn't really sexy to you, but when you're buying these at dimes, and sitting on them for a while, it's good. When you are trading them away from standard players who just don't care about anything that's not in their standard deck, it's great. I think EDH not only is like the primary price driver, but for a long time, people didn't realize that they could go to a vendor and get something other than like a dime on a lot of the rares they didn't use. And it was because people were playing more than just like the 200 cards their pet format was responsible for. I got in with EDH Rec because Dawn noticed there were a bunch of pingbacks in my articles. I was always linking to EDH Rec when I wrote for MTG Price. And we started talking as a result of that. Now I'm the content manager. It was kind of a crazy ride. But It all started with me using EDH Rec as a finance tool set, because if you listen to what people say they're going to play or say they think people should play, you're getting one person's perspective. But I think the wisdom of the crowds prevails, and they're going to have a much more accurate take on not just averages, but like, total demand and that sort of thing. So like when they printed Eiley, I wrote an article on MTG Price, sort of like, well, I used EDH Rec to figure out what cards could go in a cleric deck. And I was like, I think these will go up. And then they just didn't, because like nobody used Eiley as a cleric deck. If I'd waited for EDH Rec data, which is what I learned to do after that kind of fiasco, if I'd waited for data, everybody was building Eiley as a life gain deck. And I could have targeted those life gain cards, and made out. Like I missed on Boon Reflection because I was buying, like Starlit Sanctum. So once I started waiting for what people were actually playing and like what they demonstrated they were playing on the basis of they register a deck on Archidect or Moxfield or Goldfish or Scryfall or something like that EDH Rec scrapes. Once they actually committed that idea to paper and like, this is my list, and you started seeing the averages of what people were playing, it's sometimes a little bit different than what you would have thought, but you have data backing it up. So I don't have to know anything about EDH to be able to look at this data. So I do know about EDH, and that helps me even more, but it's so much easier to make finance picks when you have data backing it up. You take all the conjecture out of it, and then it doesn't feel like you're speculating. It just feels like you're buying and waiting for inevitability.
Yeah, and I think like some of the things that you really mentioned there, like that, I think that really hits home is, back when we were first doing this, when EDH still in its infancy, a lot of people tended to overlook a lot of cards that we would see as being commonplace in EDH now, right? Like when Innistrad first came out, like no one ever thought about Balefire Dragon, right? Like, Theros, sure. Like Porphyros, like was not anyone's radar as being a playable card. Heck, even like, when we look back 2 years ago, right, with Ravnica Allegiance, right, like when Smothering Tithe first came out, right, no one put it on the radar, and now it's the most expensive card in that set, like surpassing Shockland, surpassing everything, right?
And that's after what, like a reprint? It was in like a Brawl deck, and then it was a Mystery Booster or something. Like there have been multiple Smothering Tithes out there, and it's still more expensive than anything in that set. It's crazy.
Right. And I think the nature of it, I think EDH overall has done a very good thing for Magic, because it's basically created a lot of longevity to some of these sets, because, prior to EDH really taking off, basically people would approach standard rotation and just look at it as like being the death of a set, right? And like a lot of these cards, you see a lot of these kind of older sets before they really started designing with EDH in mind, right? You have basically competitive cards, and then you have cards that are basically worthless because they weren't putting big splashy legendary creatures like, Praetors are like a perfect example of this, right? Prior to that, you didn't really have these big legendary creatures that would work as commanders that have kind of these over the top effects in EDH, because it was just wasn't being designed with EDH in mind.
Sure. Remember when we all thought Saviors of Kamagawa was the worst set of all time? We're like, you get a Pithing Needle or you get nothing. This set sucks. EDH is one of the reasons that Saviors of Kamagawa boxes are so nuts, because the set is nuts. Like you have 28 legendary creatures or something like that in the set that are all nuts. You get stuff like Miko Koro and Oboro, Kamiya the Crescent Moon, a ton of like Myron the Moaning Well. You have a ton of utility stuff. You have big splashy stuff like Mason the Mind Cage. You've got like kind of more casual stuff like Seed the Land for, people playing that kind of snaky garbage. But then you have like just decent utility stuff like Overwhelming Instinct and Shifting Borders. Like a set like Saviors is deep, and it's got like real cards worth real money in it. Just they've had to reprint a ton of stuff from Kamigawa block, which everybody hated at the time, because EDH is like, well, actually, if you look at something being hugely narrative driven, having like really committing to its own lore, whether you like it or not, and taking some risks with some abilities that we couldn't really have anticipated would have been that good. you start to really understand what EDH has done for a block like Kamagawa when they went for it, and everyone's kind of like, eh. Like, this is between the broken Mirrodin block and the broken Ravnica block. Like, this is what we're doing. So I think, like, to the extent that stuff like Kakusha was a little bit fringe playable in standard, and then like it was bannable as a commander. I think that the power level was high, and they're like, well, we got to make the mana cost high, and everyone's like, 5-6 mana is too slow. All of a sudden, you go back and you're like, 5-6 mana is not too slow, and also like I'm interested in playing a 12 mana commander like Iname as one because I have a good idea for it. Or like Sasaya Orochi Assistant is actually busted if most of your deck is forests. You can start to do some of that insane stuff with a higher power level. And I think standard really didn't scratch the surface of what was good and rich about a block that's just, when you go and look at it now with a focus on EDH, it's just a ton of depth. And I think EDH, that was a gift that it gave the Magic community, because like we look back on that block fondly now. We were like, hey, maybe we do go back to Kamagawa, because that was like a joke at the time. It was like, Mara, why don't we go back to Kamagawa? But like, now that EDH matters, people are saying maybe we do, just because we know we'll get good legends, we'll get good utility lands, we'll get a ton of really powerful spells that cost a lot of mana, and we're fine with that.
Yeah, and I think like, now that you mentioned like with at the time, right, when there were so many less formats, right, people were just naturally like playing less things. When you're looking at standard, right, at the time you had standard, you had, right, we're talking like Kamigawa, this is 2002 or something, right, 2001, 2002, right, people are looking
like 2003 or 4, I think, but yeah,
it may be a little bit later, you may be right, but right at this time, right, people are basically looking at standard. Modern is close to a decade away from coming into existence. This was before Legacy actually existed, right? Before, for a while, it was Type 1 and Type 1.5. And Type 1.5 was just Type 1, except all the cards are restricted, are now banned instead. You don't really have a separate identity for Legacy yet, right? So people are, again, basically just looking at cards in a very kind of simple way, right? People are like, 6 mana for Kokusho, this effect is like kind of fringe playable and like not really that good, right? People were playing like Heartbeat of Spring, right? Like the 3-mana enchantment that doubles your mana. And people again were just kind of looking at it as, are these cards playable in standard? Is this set going to change standard? If not, then it's whatever. And for the longest time, right, Saviors did go down as being such a poor set because you're basically, like you mentioned, looking at like big splashy legends, lands that have kind of unique effects that have been fringe playable in terms of competitive play, but haven't really taken off until EDH has really picked it up. Like Orboro is kind of a perfect example. That card has basically been steady in price. There's no reprint on it, and then it just took off in the past like 2 months or something.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors behind something like that. Something like Oboro just going nuts in the pandemic. Dealers aren't restocking. People got those stimulus checks. There's just a lot of reasons something like that would happen, but the demand is there. Oboro's the 9th most played card in that block. So, or in that set, not that block. So, I mean, there's demand for it. It does some unique stuff. And it's a good block in hindsight. And if you remember back then, a block constructed was a thing, and Kamagawa block constructed was awesome. It was a ton of fun. It was because you weren't like disappointed that you didn't have access to Ravnica or Mirrodin. It was just sort of like, this is what we're doing. So block constructed for Kamagawa was very fun, and it should have been more of a signal to people that like there was something to these sets. But opening packs of Saviors was miserable back then. It was like, oh cool, I didn't get a Pithing Needle, so it was a $25 card, which was like unheard of back then. Like Umezawa's Jite probably would have been the first card to hit $40 in standard if it hadn't been in a $12 precon, which I guess was my first foray into MTG finance. As much as like, oh, 2010. No, I was buying I was going to all grocery stores and Target and stuff like that. And I was like, "Will you open up a pack so I can buy all the rat's nests and leave all the other precons alone?" Until stores started to say, "No, we're not going to do that." It's like, "Oh, I really like chocolate ice cream. Can you open up a carton of Neapolitan for me?" It was just, they were just sort of like, the rest of this doesn't sell. We're not going to bust a carton and then the rest of it'll sit there. So, um, I think Needle could have been the first standard card to hit 40, and now we don't bat an eye at a $40 card in standard. I bought a bunch of $40 copies of the extended art foil Omnath, and they like banned it 2 weeks later. I was like, well, that happens. So as much as like Magic's come a long way in terms of like quality and stuff like that, it's also like the amount of abuse we're willing to take as people invested in the game, I think, has increased too.
It's kind of funny that you mentioned foils because foils from that era, specifically from that set, have a huge multiplier over the non-foil
Yeah.
version, which is something which is a pretty foreign concept to us nowadays, right? We look at, like you mentioned Omnath, right? Like the non-foil version is like, I think like 14, $15 post banning, and the foil version is like $17, right? There's just like no demand for foils anymore. Whereas back then, because foils, were much more rare, we didn't have collector boosters, we didn't have packs where foils were guaranteed, right? You look at some of these old foils, you're looking at cards that have like anywhere from like a 3 to like 5 times multiplier.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I just have TCG Player pulled up in front of me right now since we talked about it, right? Oboro, you can find copies kind of in the $45 to $50 range. For foil versions, there's 2 listings. There's the heavily played foil, which is $110, and a lightly played foil for $158, right? That's a 3x multiplier. And obviously, like, you may think that's outlier because that's kind of because that's the most expensive card in the set. But we look at something, there's some more cards like Sakashima. I believe this is the Savior's foil is actually the only foil printing of Sakashima, because it was reprinted in the Plane Chase deck, but there's obviously no foil in that. Right, the foils, like played foils, are probably like in the $100 range, and we're talking about a card that's like $10 post the reprint. I think it's in the mystery booster as well. The non-foil version definitely affordable, but these foils still maintain a lot of value. Mirror and Moaning Well, right? Same idea. $10 non-foil card and like a $30 foil. And EDH, I think, just like this is clearly something that is a result of EDH people just pushing like to have all foil decks, and it's really keeping like these foils alive because foils just within like the past decade have a pretty bad rep because people just don't like foils. The printing quality has been poor.
Yeah.
Foils are becoming much more commonplace, right? This kind of started with the with Mod Masters when they started guaranteeing a foil in every pack, and it just kind of made foils feel much less unique than they did, in 2004.
At their heyday, foils were good for your forever deck. You could buy foil Dark Ritual or foil Brainstorm, and you would pay a lot of money for like a Japanese foil Mercadian Masks Brainstorm, but you're like, well, this is my Brainstorm forever. I'm going to never take this Legacy deck apart because Legacy is a non-rotating format. And EDH felt that way to people. They're like, how could I possibly take this deck apart? It means so much to me. This is my deck now. So, like, it's tough to make the case for foiling out your standard deck unless you're, like, laundering money, right? So, like, it's like, well, the meta could change next week and then this set will rotate in a little bit. Like, why would I foil out something that's this transient? But EDH introduced another way for cards not to rotate. And all of a sudden, people were like, oh, here's another permanent deck that I can leave together, so why not foil it? And back then, it was like 1 foil rare, 3 foil uncommons, and 5 foil commons per box. Like, that was it. So, like on these older sets, it's not only any amount of demand is going to get there because the supply is so low, and like it's not getting bigger. They'll occasionally throw something like Kamiya the Crescent Moon in a set, and then it's like there's more foils of that, but still people like the original foil printing more. So, the harder to reprint something is, the better the foils look. And if an EDH player pays $35 for a foil copy of something that goes in their deck and it gets reprinted, they're not going to complain. They're just like, oh, whatever. Maybe I'll buy one for another deck.
Yeah, and I think like again, some of these cards, like just the nature of foils, very very hard to reprint, very very low supply in a lot of these old foils. You That's why you really notice like foils kind of from the era before, even with things that have been reprinted. Right, we look at like Dark Confidant. Right, Dark Confidant has gone through multiple reprints. There you can get it in a bunch of different ways. You can get the foil in a bunch of different ways. Original Ravnica foils, very very expensive still relative to like a double masters foil or something, which has almost no premium over the non-foil version. So right. Just something to keep in mind when you're buying foils. Usually for most stores that do know this, right, like in your EDH crowd, really is a good way to be able to dump your foils onto, because if you can find someone that has that deck, right, you're almost guaranteed to have a customer, especially on some of these old obscure foils that are very very hard to find. So
I also don't tend to advocate foils a ton because I think they're hard to move. Everyone talks about that guy, like that guy wants this card, but like I gotta find that guy. And the internet's made it a little bit easier, and like anybody being able to sell on TCG Player and eBay has helped. Like I got my start selling on Card Shark. That's like how long I've been selling singles. So like I get that you can move one or two copies in like a decent time frame, but like advocating picking up like dozens of copies of an EDH foil, that's something I don't personally advocate. I know some other people have been like, well, my hit rate is pretty good, but I think realistically, if you're giving a large audience advice, I think your advice needs to be different than if you're giving a small number of insiders advice. So um, people ask me a lot like why I'm not so bullish on EDH foils, and it's just like, well, the first 3 or 4 people who are quick can make some money here, but I'm not telling hundreds or thousands of people to do something that only 3 or 4 people are going to benefit from. But if you are so inclined to sit and wait for that guy to come along, some of these EDH foils can be very fantastic, and it can be very obvious when something gets reprinted that the price is going to go right back up and the foil and non-foil price are going to diverge.
Very true. Very good points. Moving on a bit, what do you think the state of MTG finance looks like? Like, how has it evolved over the years? Because like you said, you've done this probably for a better part of a decade now, so you've kind of seen it through thick and thin. Like, where do you think it's at now versus where it was back then?
More stuff matters. As much as like digital is becoming more of a thing, because like MTGO is sort of like, I want to draft late at night, so what are my options? That's why MTGO was sort of great, but Arena's just become like the way that they are advertising to play Magic now. So paper is going to shift way harder into EDH, and they're going to try to keep FNM interesting, but like Standard's so bad, that's kind of sucking. I think Brawl, I understand why they introduced Brawl, right? Because people who mostly play Standard but didn't really want to get into EDH hardcore liked the idea of having something they could do with the Standard stuff that they opened in packs that they couldn't really use in their Standard deck. So I understand where they were coming from with that, but like you have a low power format that also rotates. It feels really bad. I think Brawl could catch on eventually. And if it's not Brawl, it could be something very similar to Brawl. People really seem interested when someone comes out with something like Tiny Leaders or Oathbreaker. Everyone's really jazzed for a while just because it's something new. So I think innovation like that is going to continue to happen. I don't think anything else is going to stick because everybody's so entrenched in EDH. There's really no reason to switch. EDH is a perfect format. So I think if they do come up with something that's like Brawl, but like actually good that people like, as much as I like Oathbreaker, I'd be fine with Oathbreaker sticking around, but like it just hasn't really caught on. But something like that would ultimately be good for paper. So EDH isn't, carrying all the weight. Something distinct enough from EDH that different cards actually matter. That would be nice. So we can't rely on something like that coming along. So I really think the future of paper is probably FNM and EDH. And I think tournament play just, I think if Grands Prix come back, they will just be Magic Fests, right? Like, it's like there is technically a main event, but we're mostly here to go to Fogo de Chao in a new city and hang out with our friends and get drunk at the hotel. We're not really here to play 10 rounds of Magic on a Saturday per se. It'll be more kind of smaller tournaments maybe, and there will be like just EDH stuff, and it'll just be like a fest, which I'm fine with. But I think like the Pro Tour level type stuff, which was gated off from people anyway, why not just play that on Moto? Why make somebody fly all the way to Brazil to play, you know, in a tournament where they could just play from home?
I think that's like a very, very good point. Like, I think in my experience, prior to the pandemic kind of shutting everything down, as Magic Fest really became a mainstream, Magic Fest was something they introduced, I believe, in Vegas in 2019. That was kind of their first like foray into that, and then they've basically expanded to having not Magic Fest, Command Fest, and being a part, expanding, starting in Vegas, and then kind of bringing it to every single event, and then them actually having just a full on Command Fest where it was nothing but Command Fest itself. Right, I think that really speaks to kind of the same things you're saying, where people gather not necessarily for the tournament itself, right? That it felt like each passing tournament, the main event, the actual tournament part, standard, modern, limited, what have you, it was slowly getting pushed more and more to the back burner because people stopped. No, I don't want to say people stopped caring about tournament magic, but it felt like in terms of value, in terms of what made sense to people, I think driving like an hour or two to your nearest Magic Fest to play in the Command Fest, get all your friends together for a weekend, hang out, go to Fogo, drink beer in a hotel late at night and play EDH for, 72 hours straight. That is probably that probably has much more appeal to a broader range of people versus the people that have done tournament magic for a while. Like, you can only go to so many new cities and want to be flying around the world to exhaust yourself over 72 hours or whatever. I think that's really going to kind of become, in my mind, what Magic will be once we kind of return to normalcy, whatever that looks like in 2021 or what have you.
Not that I hate the idea of the Magic Fest model. Like, I think people still want to go to a convention center in a weird city. If it's drivable, why not pack the car full of your friends and pack the hotel room full of your friends? It's I think it'll still be, when it comes back, I think it'll still be a good place for dealers to buy cards. And I think people are realizing people going to Magic Fest and selling cards to the dealers is a much more vital part of the economy than anybody anticipated. Who's outside the industry? Everyone in the industry like knows like just what a huge deal it is. Where dealers like, oh shit, I ran out of money because I only brought $250,000 to this Magic Fest. So I think people are realizing that like weird things are happening on TCG Player and on these other sites as a result of like dealers just having a really super tough, like Channel Fireball is like, we are having such a tough time getting cards. Just don't bother set sorting and alphabetizing. We're so bored. Send us everything in a box. We'll set sort and alphabetize it for you. We don't care. We just want your cards and we want something to do. And that's a cool innovation, but I hope that's not the future of MTG finance from a buyer's perspective. I really hope that we get those venues to get those cards into the market back, because $45 or Boro isn't normal. And as much as EDH is pulling a lot of strings, it should not pull that much weight. Just because we're doing landfall now doesn't mean that's a $45 card. So I think the future of Magic hopefully is the dealing with the pandemic. And if the United States is going to be this terrible at dealing with the pandemic, it's going to be a problem, because like a lot of the Magic Fests were in the US, and people from the US aren't going to be able to travel anywhere else. because we're all infected and we won't wear masks. So it's going to be really tough. I think maybe a couple more years of the pandemic not really being under control is going to really shift the paper market in really funky ways. And I think more people are going to have to innovate like Channel Fireball has done. Otherwise, I don't actually know what's going to happen. I don't want to prognosticate. I just will say that things are a little bit goofy right now, and everyone's like, "We'll give this a year until we start to worry." So, the future of Magic, I hope isn't just people can't get boxes of Jumpstart, and whoever does list their tiny bones for $100 on eBay and it sells within minutes. I hope that's not the future of Magic Finance, because it's getting real Mad Maxy out there.
Yeah, I think it's definitely been kind of a the pandemic has really kind of changed fundamentally how people operate, how businesses operate. Just a lot of inefficiencies are really becoming pronounced now. We can really see those kind of front and center, right? Like
Yeah.
we talk about some of these prices, right? Like this clearly wouldn't happen with Oboro. Like it may still happen, right? Oboro may be more expensive than it was at the beginning of the year, but it would probably be a more gradual increase simply because events are really a good avenue for keeping the economy circulating, right? People are selling cards, dealers are being able to restock and then put those cards back into players' hands, and then they move to a different city and then rebuy those cards and put those into different players' hands, etc. So kind of on the topic of the pandemic, how's it kind of affected you in terms of what you've done with content, with singles, and kind of how's your perspective changed on the market itself?
Um, I cannot get into specific numbers or even ratios. What I will say is that EDH Rec has affiliate deals in place with Card Kingdom and TCG Player, and we have tracked our sales pre and post pandemic, and EDH is doing well. It's doing fine. I'm not going to say if our numbers are way up or way down or anything. I'm just going to simply say that, like, somebody who knows how much you know money passes through TCG Player and Card Kingdom from a place like EDH Rec, EDH has been fine. EDH Rec didn't like, well, nobody's buying nothing, we got to lay everybody off. We maintained through this whole ordeal. People are buying paper cards using our affiliate links, and I can extrapolate that it's probably the same number of people, like, as a percentage, just buying I think the whole market's fine. I don't think like the only people buying before and buying now were buying through edhrec.com. I kind of think the whole EDH market is fairly healthy. And I think if your LGS is open and people can come into the store and shop, at least, like, everybody at my LGS is masked up. They're always cleaning, and there aren't a ton of people in the store, but like you can go in there and buy singles, and that's been good for them. So I think to the extent that you can physically sell EDH cards to people, I think you're probably doing okay. If you're relying on F&M, you may have to shift your business model a little bit. I mean, some stores are trying, it's like, we put up plexiglass barriers, and it's like, calm down, it's F&M. I'm not getting COVID so I can get a alternate art cultivate. Like, it's just fine. I haven't missed playing in an LGS. I think webcams have been huge. Spell Table came along at perfect time. So people still need paper cards to play on webcam. People are doing those EDH boxing leagues and buying boxes they wouldn't have bought otherwise, So I think out of a desire to play Magic the Gathering, people have solved some of the market's problems for it. And I think that's been good.
Yeah, I obviously didn't want you to say anything that you're not comfortable saying, or disclosing numbers that you shouldn't be. But I think I think you would have to be pretty oblivious to what's happening to know that like no one's saying that LGSs are shut down, paper Magic is gonna die, right? That's obviously what people thought back in March, like within kind of the first few weeks when things did go into full lockdown. But I think since then, if you've done any looking around at all, right? It's very obvious that EDH cards have done well. Like you said, the advent of webcam magic making it accessible for people. I know no shortage of people that just their version of FNM is literally they're all at home on their computers and playing EDH with three other people somewhere on the internet. Even doesn't even have to be in the same proximity, just in different states or what have you. This is how they replicate that experience of playing FNM at their game store. They're just doing so safely from their homes, and those people probably really haven't changed their spending habits at all. They're probably buying the same amount of product nowadays. They're probably following up on Zendikar Rising, maybe upgrading their expeditions to get like a cool alternate art frame. They're still buying the same cards that they were before. They're just not doing so, like you said, in person, physically in store as much.
I do
E-commerce.
it more than I used to. I'm sure I'm an outlier, but like it makes me feel normal to if I'm ever out of the house. Like I basically take my daughter to school and go to the post office, right? Like that's the extent to which I leave the house. So I will stop by the LGS just to feel normal and like browse a display case. I'm spending more at the LGS than I was before. Like it makes more sense to buy online, but like I'm buying a larger percentage of my stuff in person than I ever did before. And I think part of that is just my LGS is clean and safe and like everybody's masked up and I'm not worried about transmission there. So it's really a case of like it just makes me feel normal to go in a store and browse. And there aren't too many other places I would go in. So I think people aren't going to the movies, people aren't going to the bar, people aren't going to Disney World or whatever big vacation type thing you were going to do. If people are going on vacation, they're like camping. So like the amount of ways to blow your money have decreased to such an extent that like a lot of people Magic is their like one diversion. That's why like you can't find a Nintendo Switch anywhere right now, but like nobody's going to amusement parks. People are just they had this money and it's like what do you do with it? So I think that's why Paper Magic is doing pretty well. And I never would have gone through the trouble of like setting up all the infrastructure to play webcam EDH if it wasn't the only way to do it. But like I'm glad I did. I play a couple games a week now. I didn't or a couple sessions a week of a couple games each. Like I never played that much EDH before. So it's the more I play, the more I get sick of a deck and I want to build a new one. So like I think these solutions that the community has found have actually strengthened the game. Like I play more EDH during the pandemic than I did before, and that I can't be the only one.
Yeah, absolutely not. We'll kind of wrap things up here. Let's look at two products that are coming out. We have two products, two big Commander centric products. Commander
Yeah.
Legends, Commander Collection Green. Thoughts on those?
Commander Collection Green's going to be quite good. The cards in it are very good, and I think the spell books were fine, right? Like some people were like, no, I don't care about the spell book, but it's like, yeah, but like dealers are going to just bust tons of these because you get like the foils are random and like, it was very cost effective, especially when they were very new to bust these. The better the cards in them, the better they sell, obviously. Um, Doing green, great idea. Um, it was a way to get people reprints of cards that they didn't want to have ruin a set. And with good new art. I think it's a fantastic product. Um, I think I think it's going to be so easy to buy those, though, that like it could impact prices more than we're prepared for. But like, who cares? You know, I will sell more copies of a cheap card as long as I don't buy them now and then the stuff gets reprinted. Then I'm like, oh no, look at all the money I lost. Like, you can't lose money on these. You just buy them and then you sell the singles because people want them. So I will sell more affordable copies of Sylvan Library than I would unaffordable copies of Sylvan Library. So I think the the method for like dealers has changed from overhead to volume um, at like the GP level anyway. You know, I think that I think Caffrey does a great job of that. I think 95 does a good job of that. I think anybody who's doing a ton of GPs just knows you know what, we'll pay the most and sell for the least, and that shrinks our margins, but we just do so much throughput, it doesn't matter. I think if you're doing throughput, you're going to be very happy with these products. And if you're a player, you can buy something that have probably 3 decks worth of green cards that you need, um, for a decent price, as long as we don't run into jumpstart esque supply issues where it's like, well, the price didn't go down at all because they didn't release enough, and then they released another wave of not enough, and then they never released another wave of not enough. So like people have no choice but to keep buying at the old price just to have some new supply. If that doesn't happen, I think it'll be a great product for prices too. Commander Legends is going to smash a lot of cards into complete powder. Even with like the new frames, like I don't want to discuss leaks per se because I hate leaks, but I had to look for my job. So um, there's new frames on cards like Prosh and um, Zedru and stuff like that. So that may attenuate some of the price tanking because people are like, oh well, uh, I'm just gonna buy a new Zedru because I like the new art better. I think I think the new cards are going to be pretty good. It was designed to booster draft, and that's not going to happen at all, and that kind of sucks. Like no one's going to be able to draft this set, and that is what it is. So it's almost a shame that like some of the bad cards that need to go in the set and some of the ways the set is set up to make it draftable like don't matter to us in a pandemic. So I think that's unfortunate. The set could have been better in some respects, but like not every card needs to be gas, I guess. So I think Commander Legends is going to be quite good. It's going to give us a ton of new decks. Um, Anytime there's partners, you get a ton of combinations. And if there are 2 that draw a card, competitive EDH is going to get involved. And as much as competitive EDH, it's like the legacy of EDH where there's like 100 cards that matter because every CEDH deck runs the same 90 cards. So like if more people, like everyone said, oh, Omnath came out, and the CEDH community is like, well, it draws a card when it comes into play, which means we have access to Enlightened Tutor. And like that was the conversation. They're like, you can Enlighten Tutor for your food chain because it's a food chain deck. We did it. We did the CEDH thing where there's a right answer. So I think if you have something like Timna the Weaver and Thrasios, where they like you get like some card draw, it's possible competitive EDH buys some of the singles out of this set if they need to go on that deck. But I think it's going to have something for everybody, and it's all hands on deck at EDH Rec because there are 1,500 possible new partner combinations, and they all might need their own page. So that's been the thing, planning for that. That's I think we set a threshold. It's like, look, if there's not 10 decks on Archidec, we're not going to make the page. So it's up to people to show us what they are building and what we want to plan for. But say there are 1,500 new decks just from those combinations. I think that's pretty rad. It's whatever, right? It's it's something that Magic was going to do eventually anyway. They were going to go back to partners. So I'm ready for the year Commander to be over because it has felt like a relentless onslaught of new products aimed right at our wallets. And as someone who has to care about all of it because it all matters financially and I have to generate content, we do preview cards and we do set reviews and all that kind of junk. Having a set every month sucks, or a product every month just sucks. But I think if you're going to cap the year off, I will be very critical of WotC when I think they've made a bad choice. I think Commander Legends is a very good choice. I thought Battle Bond was very good. I liked both Conspiracies. I think if they do a product like that every year and do less of the smaller stuff, like you don't need to do the Commander Spellbook and you don't need to do the set EDH decks and you don't need to do all that junk to get us reprints if you're going to do a conspiracy type set every year. And the fact that they did both feels overwhelming, and I really hope they tone it back next year. Like, they're going to see how much money they made, and they're going to be like, oh, it's because we're making good products and not everyone's trapped in their houses with a $1,200 check. So I really hope they learn the right lesson from this. But to the extent that I trust Gavin Verhey to design a set that is going to make Commander players happy, Commander Legends, I'm predicting, is going to be very good, and very good for the markets also.
I think like one of the points that you really hit on the head is like the nature of Commander is that whenever there's something new, right? Like in this instance, you said partners, right? Like just new combinations, new synergies, new interactions, right? Like this is really what causes probably the most shifts in the market, right? You have cards that are just like basically coming out of the woodwork. People are discovering, right? Like, you know, like, you know, like in the case of Oboro, right? I'm just gonna use this example because it's the most recent one. This one off the top of my head, right? Landfall isn't anything new. Oboro's been around since 2004, right? Why now? And it just happens that the new Omnath particularly powerful, right? Oboro just happens to be a moving piece that really helps the interaction with Omnath, right? And that's kind of one of the things that really just pushes for these big changes. And with Commander Legends, the nature of Commander being as completely wide open as it is, and like at the beginning of the episode, you had mentioned that EDH is largely going to be responsible for these 500 cards or whatever that are worth more than bulk, right? When you have new synergies coming in, now we may be looking at 100 new cards that weren't on the radar before, that some new obscure interaction with new partner A plus previous partner B is probably going to push partner B up through the roof or whatever, and it's probably going to bring in new interactions that work because this combination didn't exist before.
Yep. And that's how I tend to do EDH finance. I don't like, people ask me what the price of cards in a new set is going to be, and I almost always punt on that because I don't care. I don't think it matters. I think when you get a new legend, who cares how much the legend costs? How much is Omnath going to make Ghost Town cost? What is Omnath going to do to the price of Burgeoning? What is Anawan going to do to the price of Una's Blackguard? Distant Melody. High synergy cards that, like, yeah, they were a thing before, but all of a sudden, like, every new Anawan deck is going to have an Una's Blackguard in it. Has it been printed too many times? Is it still a bulk pick? Is Gaunty going to go up? Non-mythic legendary creatures in the post-mythic era are very slow to climb, unless they get some help from another deck. So, as much as like you're vulnerable to reprints, I think the older the card and the tougher to reprint, the better it looks if it was never used before. Some goofy red enchantment from like Mercadian Masks all of a sudden takes off. It doesn't go from 20 cents to 50 cents because the demand doubled. It goes from 25 cents to $25 just because, like, where are you going to get more copies of a red rare from Mercadian Masks? It's tough. Supply is, it's fine for the current demand, but like if the demand moves at all, those copies are going to dry up immediately. And without the ability to buy the cards at GPs, it's going to go, straight into people's decks. It's going to bypass the market. People are going to find the cards at their LGS for a quarter and just throw it in their deck. So I think without people who are feeding the market, some of this stuff could get real weird. So as a player, I recommend you pay very close attention and be thinking about how you would build a deck right when you see stuff spoiled, because like there's not going to be much time between something being discovered and spiking hard, because there's not a ton of ways to get cards into the back onto the selling platforms. And once they sell out there, the price goes up whether or not that same amount was going to sell a second time. So like they have 100 copies, those 100 copies sell out for $1. If they put 100 up more, they're not going to put the price at $2. They're going to put the price at like 15 or whatever. And they're not going to sell 100 copies at $15. But if you are the 101st person to buy, you got to pay 15. So don't let yourself be in that position. think about what you want to play. Plan the whole deck once you see the commander spoiled, and anything you think you're going to need. If it's not used a ton, I would buy in quickly. And if you're on the other position, if you're somebody in finance, think about that too. Think about the whole deck, because normally we're getting like 4 or 5 new legendary creatures per set, 2 or 3 that matter. We're going to get a whole lot in Commander Legends. It's going to be like 3 years worth of EDH decks in one weekend. It's going to be pretty nuts.
Fair enough. So we're approaching the hour mark. We'll go ahead and get this wrapped up. So I do have one last question for you. It's not on the outline. I do like to kind of keep this in wraps. So if you had $100,000 right now, and you could not see that money back for 5 years, and you had to invest it in something, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be Magic. It doesn't necessarily have to be EDH. What would you do with that 100,000, and how do you invest it?
I mean, I probably wouldn't invest it in EDH stuff, just because I think even if they did abolish the reserved list someday, which I think is a bad idea, I think the reserved list stuff is really safe right now. And as much as it's volatile, because like anytime people get an influx of cash, like a couple years ago in Vegas, crypto had just peaked, and everyone's like, I got to get all this crypto money. So people bought reserve list stuff then, it all went up, and then demand fell. It went back down. It went back up during COVID, because I think people got those stimulus checks and people weren't going to Disneyland, and for whatever reason, reserve list stuff looked pretty safe. There's like a pseudo reserve list for stuff that you think is on the reserve list but really isn't, but they just never print. If I had 100K to just like sock somewhere, it really wouldn't suck to buy a bunch of reserve list stuff, especially playable stuff. I'm not buying North Star, or whatever. I'm not buying Sentinel Centaurs, but I would buy some playable stuff and just sit on it. And that sucks, because I think that's sort of antisocial to do that, because it makes the game harder to play. But I mean, the premise of your question is, what would someone in MTG Finance do with like that much money? And if I couldn't invest it in my children somehow, I would probably just park it somewhere safe. And I don't trust that the reserve list will be abolished in the next 5 years, if ever. So that seems pretty good to me.
So I guess to kind of, without going too much deeper, so what does that reserve list stuff look like? Like, are we spending like 100 grand on the nicest Lotus you can find, or are you just spending like 100 grand on like Underground Seas and dual lands?
I think it's the mid-tier stuff. Like there's crap, right? There's stuff on the reserve list like, oh, we're never going to reprint Sorrow's Path or whatever. I think there's some mid-tier like EDH playable stuff in the like $10 to $20 range that I would target. Like I don't want to be spending 5 grand, 10 grand on a Lotus. I certainly don't be spending like real money on super high graded power. I think if the reserve list keeps those prices increasing and like EDH demand stays the same, there are a lot of like $10, $20 EDH playable cards that will be 40 in 5 years.
Fair enough. So with that, thank you all for listening. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Edwin13. You can find the social media sites for Vermilion on the right. Jason, where can people find you on the internet if they want to contact you, read your stuff, what have you?
I'm on Twitter at Jason E. Alt. I have a pin post at the top of my page that has a link to my author page on Cool Stuff Inc. and MTG Price. Has a link to both of my podcasts, and just a reminder to go to EDH Rec for all your EDH or Rec related needs, and buy the cards using our affiliate link, because that keeps people employed if you do that.
Very cool. Jason, thank you again for joining me for an hour. I always appreciate having guests on, being able to get different perspectives from different parts of the industry, and just really seeing people, how people are doing, and how the pandemic has kind of affected what they do and their overall interpretation of what's going on in our collectible industry. So for that, I do thank you again. For all listeners out there, thank you for joining us for this interview. Wherever you are in the world, stay safe, and we'll be back here tomorrow with another episode. Thanks again for listening.